So in this project, I'm going to show you how to make this countdown flip clock timer using JavaScript. And there are lots of different ways, there are lots of different variations on how to create a flip clock in this way. But for this tutorial, I wanted to take out all of the complexity and try and make this as simple as possible so that you can understand what we're actually trying to do when we're making this flip clock timer, but also leave it in a way where you can customize it to make it your own as well. So the key things that you're going to learn in this tutorial is how to work with the DOM and how to insert values into parts of the markup that we're going to be creating, but also we'll be looking at how to work with the date object in JavaScript. And we'll also work on breaking our code down into small functions so that you can understand what's going on and reuse them elsewhere if you need to. So let's get started making our JavaScript countdown flip clock. So over here in Visual Studio Code, we're going to start coding up our countdown timer. And the first step we're going to take is actually to create the markup that will display the digits on the page. Now we could do this in JavaScript, we could use it to dynamically create all of the elements, but as mentioned, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. So what we're going to do is create the markup for the segments, as I'm going to call them, the digits, for the display directly here. So let's make a start over here. I've got an index page, a HTML page set up that's got the CSS and JavaScript files linked already. So over here in our body tag, I'm just going to start off by creating a div with a class of countdown, and this will hold the overall countdown timer itself, and we can use that class to make some styling in just a moment. And we're going to have different sections for each of the parts of the countdown timer. So we'll have hours, minutes, and seconds. So let's create another div inside here called time section. And I will give this an ID because it's very specific to the seconds that are going to be displayed in the countdown timer there. So that will allow us to target it with JavaScript later on. So inside of here, we've got a couple of things. I'm going to create another div with a class of time group, and that will hold the segments, the displays of the digits themselves. But we also want to have a label inside of here as well. So we're going to have a label of seconds. This one, for example. And so now we're starting to put together each of these sections that will hold parts of the countdown timer. So this time group is where, as I mentioned, we're going to put these segments. So I'm going to create another class inside of here, another div with a class of time segment. And the segment itself is broken down into a couple of things. The first thing we're going to have is the display of the time, or the digits themselves. So this will kind of sit as a background with the numbers displaying, and then we're going to have inside of this, or on top of it rather, we're going to have an overlay, and the overlay is going to be the thing that basically flips and the thing that is animated. So we'll always have a background with the segment display, and this segment overlay is going to be the bit that you're actually going to see moving. So inside of this display class here, we're going to have a top and a bottom part of the display. So if you remember on the demo, you could see that it was broken down. The number was split into two, and this is quite essential again because we need to have the top bit split off so we can actually animate that down. So I'm going to create two divs inside of here with segment display top, and then a second div with segment display of bottom. And I'm going to put just as an example for the moment, I'm just going to put 2 in there as the value that's being displayed for the top and the bottom. And then we need the same thing inside of the segment overlay because this is just going to sit on top of those two elements basically. So we'll have segment overlay top and then segment overlay bottom. And those will also have the same number in there as well, again just for demonstration purposes. So you should be able to see in the preview just about that we've got the content in there at the moment, but of course we can't really see how that's going to look at the moment because we need to start overlapping these elements together and start obviously adding some color as well. So because these segments are going to be identical, I can, for this time group section, because there's going to be 2 of these time segments in each of the groups, or each of the sections. So we'll just copy and paste that entire block from above there that we've just created. And you can see now we've got lots of 2s being displayed here. We've got 2 lots there at the moment. And now we're in a position where we can actually start styling this so that it appears as the segments did in the original demo. And I'm just going to leave the markup there for the moment. We've got the section for seconds at the moment, and we'll come back and add the other markup for the hours and minutes later on. But just to keep things simple so we haven't got too much on the page at the moment, I'll just keep those as it is. So we're in a position now to style it. As I said, let's go over to the app.css file. So let's start off with some basic styling. So first of all, set the box sizing to be border box, And the body element itself, I'm just going to add some padding to the top of 100 pixels, just to push what content we've got at the moment down on the page, just so we can see it a bit more easily in our preview. And then we can start styling the actual countdown timer itself. So we created a div with a class of countdown, which was a container to contain all of the other elements. So I'm going to set the display property of this to flex, just so everything appears in a row. And then that enables us to put a gap as well of 30 pixels. So each of those sections for hours, minutes, and seconds will have a bit of space around them. And for the entire countdown, we'll just set the font family to be sans serif. And then let's start styling the time section. So this will be for hours, minutes, and seconds, each of the individual sections here. And the text alignment for this will be set to centered. And this is really just for the labeling and the content of the numbers that are being displayed in there. And we'll also set the font size to be 30 pixels, which again will be for the label more. We'll change the font size of the number in just a second. And after the time section, we had this time group, which is basically holding the time segments. And again, we want to make sure that they're displaying in a row as well. So you can see now the blocks of twos are now appearing side by side. And we just want a little bit of a gap between those as well, just so they're not right on top of each other. And just helping everything to be laid out a bit better. So inside of the time groups, we've got a couple of these time segment classes. And I'm just going to set the display of that to be block. And the font size to be 100 pixels to give us a nice big number on the page. And I'll also just, while we're here, set the font weight to be 900 to be nice and bold. And I will also, for each of these segments, set an explicit width of 100 pixels. And don't forget they're being aligned in the center as well. So we've got a block there of 100 pixels wide with a number 2 in the center. So the time segment itself is comprised of a few different things. So we've got this segment display is the main thing inside it. And then we've got the top and bottom of that display, and then the overlay, which kind of is going to overlap on top of that. Just as a quick reminder. So let's target the segment display class. And that segment display class is just basically a container for all of the other elements inside there. And because we're going to be absolutely positioning the overlay, we want to make sure that this is set as relative for the position. And we'll just ensure that it's 100% of the height of the parent container. And we're not explicitly setting any heights on the time segment class because we're going to use some line height properties to ensure that we've got the right amount of space in terms of the height. So that's the basic stylings for the segment display container, but we've got a couple of components inside there, which is the top and the bottom for the display. So for segment display, we'll top, and also for segment display bottom, there's some common styles that we can put in the same rules here. So we want to make sure any overflow from that is hidden. And we can also make sure the text is still centered here. It should be from the parent, but just in case I make any changes above, just to ensure that that's in the center. And the width of this is going to be 100% of the parent container, but the height this time we're actually going to set that as 50% because we want them to be stacked on top of each other. And we'll also set the position of this to be relative too. Okay, so that's some common styles for the top and the bottom of the display. We do have some specific ones that we need to have for the top and bottom components, so some differences between them, and it's mainly to do with the colors. So we've got the background color for the top. We'll set that as a sort of dark black color, and of course we can't see the text now, so let's make sure that that's a whitish color. And one of the key things that's going to make this work is to actually set the line height property of this. And we'll set that to be 1.5 at the moment. And you might have noticed that's just added a little bit of padding around the top of it, but it's also pushed this number 2 down. So this is actually going to get cut off when we get the bottom segment to line up as well. So let's target that now. So we'll say segment display bottom. And we're going to set the background color here to be a sort of gray color. So still quite a dark color. We'll go with 333. And we'll also set the color to be a more pure white, so 3Fs. And then what we're going to do is set the line height for this particular, for the bottom bit, to be 0. And you should be able to see now that that bottom element is being pushed up and it's being cut off in the middle. Once we've added the overlay in, that will actually all line up nicely, and you'll see how it's all split into 2. So let's add in some rules for the overlay now. So for the segment overlay. That's the class for the overlay that we've created. We're going to set the position of this to be absolute. And you can see just by taking that out of the document flow now that the segments themselves, the display that we've created is lining up exactly as we want it. So they've got the top bit and the bottom bit. And you can see the numbers cut in two as it kind of gets pushed down into the div elements that we've got there. But we're not done with the overlay itself because we need to set the position of that to be 0. So it just brings it up into the segment display container. And the other thing we want to do is just set the height to be 100% and also set the width to be that fixed 100 pixels as well. And you can see that's lining up quite nicely in the middle too. The other thing as well, just before we leave this, is to set a perspective property. And this is required because the elements that are inside this segment overlay are going to actually be animated and flipped out. So if we don't set a perspective value, it might look a bit strange, and you can tweak and play with this value to get different effects and more pronounced effects as well. But when I was coding this up, about 400 pixels seemed a good solution. Okay, so if you're thinking this overlay looks a bit strange at the moment, it does because it's not lined up properly, but we need to add a few more classes to these segment overlay properties. So for same way we did for the display, so segment overlay top and also segment overlay bottom. So we're going to set the position of these to be absolute. We're going to set the overflow to be hidden. And that's especially important for these bits because they're going to be the ones that are being animated as well. And we'll set the text alignment to be centered, but this has no width at the moment, so we'll need to make sure the width is 100%. And then the height, again, is 50%. You can see those overlay classes are getting closer and closer to matching what we have for the display. But we need some specific rules here for both the overlay top and overlay bottom. So first of all, for the top, we're going to set the top value of that to be 0. Just make sure it's at the top, and we'll match the line height from the display top component as well, so we'll set it to 1.5. We're going to set the color to be the same as well, so we'll set it to that EE, and the background color was 111. And then finally we need to add in another set of rules for the segment overlay bottom class that we created. So this time we're going to set this to be the bottom of the containing element, and we'll set the line height to be 0. So that's matching for the display bottom that we've got already, so it's sitting on top of that quite nicely. And we'll set the color as well to be white and the background color to be that grey color, so 333. And just to make it look as though they're a bit more separate, like really give it that flip clock type appearance, I'm going to set the border top to be 2 pixels, solid and black. So it really looks like now there's 2 separate sections and the number has been split into 2. So that's the styling for the segments done. We can look at now how we're going to flip this segment overlay top element, which is this bit here, and reveal the display element that's behind it. So we're going to do this by creating some CSS animations, and then we're going to apply them to these segments by adding an additional class. So let's create the animations first of all. So we're going to actually have 2 animations. One will be for the top part of the segment and one will be for the bottom part of the segment. And you'll see how that works in just a second. But let's create these animations here first of all. So we'll say keyframes and we'll call this first one flip top. So at 0% of the animation, we want to make sure that the transform property is rotating the element, the top overlay segment, by making sure that that's been rotated by 0 degrees. When we get to 100% of the actual animation, when it's complete, the transform property is set as rotate X and then minus 90 degrees. And we want another animation as well, which will represent the flipping of the bottom of the segment down as well. So we'll call this one flip bottom. And this one's kind of a bit in reverse. We start at 90 degrees at the 0 at the start of the animation and go all the way to 0 degrees. But we actually want these animations to occur in sequence, so one after the other. So the top bit flips down and then the bottom bit flips down as well. So we can use a little trick here with our CSS animation and say with our flip top animation, we want to make sure that at 100% it's at 90 degrees, but we could also say at 50% Also make sure it's at 90 degrees. So whatever duration we set for this animation, it will only take actually half the time for this. And then conversely with the flip bottom, we can say at 0% and also at 50%, we want to make sure that the rotation is still at 90 degrees. And it's only after the 50% mark has been reached, 50% of the time's gone, that we start rotating down to 0 degrees. So just a little technique that you can use to introduce delays and start to sequence animations just by making sure that they don't actually start until 50% of the way through the animation, or they finish halfway through as well. So how are we going to get these animations to apply to the segment overlay bottom and top? We're actually going to do that by adding a class into the segment overlay element that's on the page. So this section here where we've got both the top and bottom of the segment overlay, we're just going to add a class onto here. We'll do it dynamically with JavaScript when we get to that point, but we'll say when we add the flip class to this segment overlay element, then we'll add those two animations. So the CSS for that will look a little bit like this. So back here we'll say segment overlay dot flip. So when that flip class is there, we want to target the segment overlay top element, and we'll just add in the animation property, and we'll say we want to use the flip top animation, and it'll be for 0.8 seconds. The time of that will just go straight. There's no speed up or slow down near the start or the end. And the same thing for the bottom bit as well, except this time we'll say for the segment overlay bottom class, we want to make sure that we're using the flip bottom animation. So we can preview how that animation will look if we just open up the DevTools here in Chrome. So if we just have a look at some of the markup that we've got down here. So here we've got the segment display and then the segment overlay for the second segment there. And if I just add the flip class dynamically here in the DevTools, you may have just been able to see there that the top and the bottom overlay elements were actually animated as the class was added. And if I just remove it from here and then add it back in, you can see the animation again. Now it looks a bit weird, and that's because of the transform origins aren't set correctly, at least for our purposes here. And we want the top segment overlay to actually flip from the bottom, or start rotating from the bottom. So we'll say the transform origin is set to bottom, and then for the bottom segment for the overlay, we want to make sure that the transform origin is starting at the top. And you can see if I save it, you can see the animation is being applied, and we're getting that nice flip down effect where the top overlay segment is being rotated down to the middle, and then the bottom segment element is being rotated to the bottom. So that's it, that's the magic of how the animation is applied. However, we don't want to be just adding the class in manually, and you can see it only appears once when the page is loaded, when that flip class is there. So we need to work on our JavaScript to actually apply that flip class every time one of these segments changes, which is a little bit easier than it sounds, but we're going to go through it step by step, and I'll show you how you get the JavaScript in place to actually update this clock and apply those classes. Just before we do that, let's actually fill out the rest of our markup here. So for all of these numbers, I'm just going to set them to be a default of 0. And then what we're going to do we've got the seconds section here already, but I'm just going to copy that entire block of markup there. And we'll have another one for hours. I'm just going to change the ID on each of these sections. All of the rest of the markup can stay the same, and our code will be able to handle that. We didn't want hours first, actually we want minutes first. And then the last one is going to be hours. Let's just change the labels as well, because they all say seconds at the moment. So we've got hours. And then finally down here is minutes. So there you go, we've got all the markup for the hours, minutes and seconds time segments, and obviously the little styling is there and the animation is ready to go. It's now time to start working on the JavaScript, so let's head on over to our app.js file and we'll start coding up the actual logic for the countdown timer. Okay, so this is probably the trickiest part of the project. But as I said at the start, we're trying to make this as simple as possible. So I'm going to break everything down into small functions, and hopefully you should see how they all fit together to actually work to create this countdown timer. So the first thing we're going to start off with is to create a target date that we're working towards. So it's just going to be a date in the future that we're counting down to. So let's just put in today's date and also a time. So I'm using a string here, which will later convert into a date object. And this probably would come from some user input at some point, but just so we've got a bit more control over where we're counting down to, we can come in here and tweak this value when we need to. So that's our target date setup, and we'll refer to that a bit later on. Before we get started working with the date and time, I'm just going to create a utility function here to actually get all of the HTML elements that are relevant to us on the page. So let's create a function, and I'll call it get time segment elements. And we're actually going to take one of these segment elements here. So it'll be this sort of level down here, the time segment, and we'll use that element to get the further elements inside it, like the display and the display top and the overlay and so forth. So let's pass in one argument here, which is the segment element itself, which will be the HTML element. And I want to get a reference to the segment display. So from that segment element that's passed in, I'm going to call the query selector function, and I'm looking for an element that's got the class of segment-display. And I'm going to use that as a bit of a base for getting all of the other elements inside it, such as the top, bottom of the display, and the top and the bottom of the overlay. So we'll create a few more variables here. We'll say the segment display top is going to use that segment display that we've just found. And again, we'll use a query selector, and we're going to get the segment display top element. Okay, so let's just copy and paste this just to save a bit of time. So we're getting the display top there. We want the display bottom as well. And we also need a reference to the overlay element itself, because we're going to be actually adding that flip class that we saw earlier on to that. So let's make sure we've got a reference to the segment overlay element. And we've got that now. So what we could do is for the overlay top and bottom components, we'll say segment overlay top is equal to the segment overlay, which is what we've just retrieved from here. And again, we'll use a query selector. And this time we're getting the segment overlay top. And then finally, we need the bottom bit for that as well. So let's just copy and paste that. And with all of those elements retrieved, what we're in a position to do now is just return them. So we'll say return. And I'm going to use the ES6 object shorthand properties. This was just going to return an object that has all of the property names that I'm giving the variables, but also the values themselves as well. So we've got segment display top, segment display bottom, segment overlay, and then segment overlay top, and finally segment overlay display bottom. So as mentioned, this is kind of just a helper class that will allow us to pass in any of these segments as a base and get all of the different parts of it back out as an object, and then we can use that elsewhere in our code. Another helper class that we want is to actually update the values that are inside of the segment itself, so the text values. So we'll create a new function here called update segment values, and when we're doing this, we're going to be updating both the overlay element and also the display element at the same time. So we'll pass in as arguments the display element and also the overlay element, and then we also need a value to set as well. And it's just going to be a simple case of saying with the display element, we're going to set the text content of that equal to the value that's provided, and also for the overlay element we do the same thing. And we can use this function now to call at any time, and it will actually update the number for one of the segments. But there's a bit more to it than just calling this one function, because we want to add the animation on and remove it afterwards each time the segment updates. So we're going to create a bit more of a complicated function here, which will make use of the update segments values function that we just created, and I'll call it update time segment. So time segment was the class that we gave for each of these digits that are on the page at the moment. So that's the purpose of this function, is to handle all of the process that's needed for updating and animating one of these segments. So we'll pass in the segment element. So we just need to pass in the actual element we want to update, and also what time value do we want to update it to. So we want to get a reference to all of the elements, all of the different classes that are inside of each segment. So we're going to make use of that function that we defined first. So we're going to create a new variable called segment elements here, and then we're going to call the get time segment elements function, which is the first one we created, and we'll just pass in the segment element that's been passed into this function. So that should give us all of the reference to all of the different parts of the segment, so we can make use of them here. So once we've got a reference to the elements, we actually want to make the flip animation happen. So from our segment elements, we should have reference to the segment overlay. And as we saw in the dev tools before, we just need to add the class to this of flip. So from its class list, we call the add function and say we want to add the flip class, and that will cause that animation to happen. And once we've done that, we actually want to update some of the values, the text values that we can see in the segment. And this is kind of a two-stage process, because we want to update the display top and the overlay bottom first, and then when the animation is finished, we want to change the display bottom number and also the overlay top number. So if we call the update segment values function that we created just above, and don't forget we need to pass in two elements, the display element and the overlay element. So from our segment elements that we've just retrieved, I'm going to pass in the segment display top and also the segment elements dot overlay bottom. And it doesn't seem to be appearing on the IntelliSense. I just wonder if I've made a mistake here when exporting it from this function. So we've got display top, display bottom, overlay top, and I've just done the same thing for display bottom again there. So make sure we've got overlay bottom being returned from that function too. So now back here, you can see it appearing now. So we've got segment overlay bottom is what we want to pass in as the overlay element to update. And of course, the value that we're going to pass into that to set on those two elements has already been passed in from this function up here. So we can just pass in that value there. So that should handle the flipping and the updating of the text in the initial part of the animation. But when the animation's finished, we want to first of all remove the class, the flip class, so that we can add it again and re-trigger the animation. But we also want to update some of the other elements that haven't been updated with the correct time as well. So within this function, I'm going to create another function, an internal function to this, called finish animation. And the reason I'm doing this will be clear in just a second. So what we want to do inside of this function is, from our segment elements, we're going to get the segment overlay and the class list. We're going to remove the flip class. And we're also going to call this update segments values function again. But this time, from our elements that we've retrieved, we want the segment display bottom and also the segment overlay top to be passed in with the time value. And then what we can do for the overlay, so segment overlay, we'll add an event listener for animation end. So once that animation in our CSS is finished, we can actually trigger the finish animation function. And the reason I just put that in its own individual function is because what we can actually do inside of this finish animation function is make a call to itself to remove the event listener of animation end, And when you're removing an event listener, you actually need to pass in the function name as well itself. So we'll just pass in the same function name here. So we could get away without putting this in here, and we could inline this particular function inside the event listener, but you'll eventually have a memory leak and the computer will probably set fire when it's run out of memory. So this will just prevent that from happening if we do have a countdown that's running for a particularly long time. So we've got a few functions set up to help us update parts of the countdown timer, but there's a couple more that we need to create before we're in a position where we can update the whole of the countdown timer. So we've got the position here where we can actually update one individual time segment, but that's going to need a number between 0 and 9 for it to work. So whereas what we're going to be passing in to the overall group here for seconds, for example, is we're going to have a number like 13 or 15. So we need to split those numbers into tens and units so that we can actually apply each of those numbers to the individual digits. So we've made our life a little bit harder by splitting them into digits, but hopefully it will give you some chance to practice a bit more with your JavaScript number manipulation skills. And that's what we're going to do in this function. We're going to create another function called update time section, or it could be update time group, because that's the group here that we're going to be updating. And I'm going to do that by first of all passing in a section ID. So that was the ID that we set up in our markup over here a long time ago. So we've got things like minutes, hours and seconds. So back here, that will be the section ID that we're passing in. And of course we still want to pass in the time value, which will be a double-digit number, again like 13, 14 or 15. So the first task is to actually split those numbers into the tens and units. So I'm just going to create another variable inside here called first number. And I'm going to use the math.floor function to basically get the result of the time value that's passed in divided by 10. And then the second number, so that'll give us the tens obviously, and then the second number will be the result of time value modulus 10. So it's kind of like dividing by 10, and whatever's left over will be put into that second number. So for example, if the number that was passed into time value here was 14, then what we'll get here is we'll get a 1, and then we'll get a 4 in this number here. So we've got our two numbers split out into separate variables. Let's also get a reference here to the section element. So we've got the ID that's being passed in. So we'll say document get element by ID and the section ID that's been passed in. And I want to call this update time segment function now with the time value for each of these numbers, but I need to get a reference to the two time segments that's in each section. So we can do that with a quick query selector here. So we'll say the time segments is equal to the section element that we've just found, and we'll say query selector all is time segment. Then we'll call the function twice. So update time segment with time segments 0. So that'll be the first one that's in this array here, and we'll pass in the first number to that, and then we'll just copy that. So time segments 1. So this is the second one. So for example, with seconds, that would be this segment over here, and then we just pass in the second number. So I feel like we've written a lot of code here, and you're probably thinking, when are we actually going to make this work? So let's go over to the console and try out some of these functions now to make sure they're working okay. So we've got this update time section function now, which is probably the most useful function that we've created. And it needs a section ID. So for example, we pass in the seconds, which is the ID for the seconds section that we've got. And then we can pass in a number. So we can say 33, for example. And when we run that, this code here will run, and we're going to run these two functions for updating each of the time segments in there, which will in turn run this main function up here for updating the segment values, which should actually cause the flip to happen, and update the number values that are inside of the segment. Oh, and it looks like some of the numbers haven't updated there quite correctly. And that's a good illustration of why we've got the display at the back and the overlay on the top. Something hasn't quite updated correctly. So if we have a look in the update segments, in the update time segment function, when we've got the finish animation function down here, we've actually put in the display top has been updated, but the overlay top has not. So this function here for updating the segment values, we have the display element and the overlay element. We just updated the wrong one there. That's okay. Let's go back here and try that again. So we'll update the time section. And you can see both of those flip, and we're now at 33. Now if we choose another number, 54 for example, they're both flipping and the numbers have been set correctly. So we've got our animation and we've got the countdown timer updating as well. So that's good. We caught that little bug there for testing. So that function's great. We're going to use that in just a moment. We can set up the timer now, but we need to work out how much time is actually remaining before we start doing a countdown. So we're going to create one more kind of helper function, which will help us work out how much time is actually remaining from the global date that we're actually working from. So this function will take in a target date time, which will actually be a timestamp, which is the number of milliseconds that have passed since the 1st of January 1970, which is a really effective way of kind of working out the difference between two different times. And I'll show you how to generate that in just a second, but we can work out how much time has passed since the 1st of January 1970 at this moment in time by using the date.now function. So that'll be like a really long number. Not sure exactly how long it'll be, but it'll be something like that. And then that'll be a similar number that we passed in here. And then we can subtract the two to work out the difference between the two dates. So let's work out the seconds remaining is equal to math.floor. And it'll be the target date time minus the current time that we just stored in now time. And then we want to divide it by 1,000 just to get it into seconds because these numbers are in milliseconds. Okay, so we're in a position now where we can work out how many hours, minutes and seconds are left based on the seconds that are remaining that we've just calculated. So we'll get the hours first. We'll say, math.floor seconds remaining. And there are obviously 60 seconds in a minute and then 60 minutes in an hour. So that should tell us how many hours are remaining from our seconds remaining variable that we've calculated. And then the minutes is a little bit more complicated, and there are different ways that you can do this. But if we first of all say the seconds remaining divided by 60, that gives us the number of minutes that are remaining, but it gives us all of the minutes remaining, including the hours as well. So we could just subtract the number of hours that we've already calculated times by 60 to get it back into minutes, and that will give us the leftover remaining minutes once we've worked out how many hours are left. And then seconds is dead easy. We just say seconds remaining is the seconds that are remaining modulus 60. So divide the time by 60, and whatever's left over are the units of seconds that are remaining from the time difference. So similar to what we did when we got all of the elements for the segment, I'm just going to return all of these values. So I'm going to return the seconds, minutes and hours, and then we can make use of that in other parts of our code. And then that finally leaves us in a position where we can write one other function, which is called update all segments. So this is going to work out the difference between the two times and then just update all of the segments that we've got on the page. And we'll say const time remaining bits is get time remaining. So we're just going to call that function that we've just created, and we need to pass in a value to this. So from our target date that we initially created at the top of our JavaScript, we're going to create a new date object from that and then work out the timestamp value of that so that we can pass it to this function here. So let's actually do that in a separate variable. So we'll say the timestamp, or rather we should probably say target timestamp is equal to a new date based on the target date, and then we'll say use the function of get time. So we can just pass that into that function now. And then inside of this time remaining bits variable, you can see we'll have the seconds, minutes and hours, which is the representation of how long is left on this countdown timer. So what we can do then is call one of our high level functions of update time section. So we want to update the seconds section with the time remaining bits of seconds. Copy that a couple of times, and we'll do the same for minutes, and also for hours. So let's actually call this function at the bottom here of our code. And as you can see, when we save it, the segments are being animated and all of the values are being populated. So we've got hours, minutes, and seconds. And it looks like we've got a bit of a problem there with seconds because it's got a decimal point in there. So up here, when we're working at the time remaining, so we actually want to do the division here and then do a math.floor. So just some extra parentheses around there. So we're subtracting the current time from the target time, dividing it by 1,000, and then making sure it's a whole number. So let's save that again. And yeah, so you can see here, every time we save it, that's updating. And you can see that the segments are all animating and they're changing values as well. So that's all good, but we don't want to continue click save to refresh the page each time we want the counter to update. So we're probably in a position now where we actually want to automate this with an interval. So that's probably the final piece of the puzzle before we tidy up. And what we can do, we could do it just before we call the update all segments function, is to set up an interval. So I'm going to assign this interval setup to a variable called countdown timer, and the reason for that is because we want to actually clear this interval when we hit 0 as well. So let's just say we're going to run this function every second, and we're going to call update all segments every second. So you can see when we refresh the page that the interval is set up and it's actually automating that for us now. So the timer is going down, it's calculating the number of seconds, minutes, and hours each time, and each of the values is updating and the animation is happening as well. It's happening a bit too much, as you can see, and we'll fix that in just a moment. But we need to do a couple of other things before we're ready to finish. So let's just stop that interval from going for the moment. So we want to clear this interval once we've reached a completed state, but we don't really know at this point when the completed state is. So we can fix that in the get time remaining. So we could make an indication here, because this is the best place to know when we've actually reached our target. And that's just a simple check to see if this now time is actually bigger than the target date time. So we can set that up in a Boolean variable. We'll say complete, and that's going to be equal to, is the now time bigger than or equal to the target date time. Okay, so what we can do for that then is, if it is complete, if it's true, then we'll stop doing any other work. We won't calculate any more of the time remaining, but what we will return is the complete value, so that Boolean true or false. We'll also return, to reset the counter, so seconds is 0, minutes is 0, and hours, is 0 as well. And then what we can do down here as well is just return that complete variable as well. So this will be false by this point, but it will just help us in our timer to work out when we should actually stop that from happening. So we need a way to get this complete value back into the interval, because that's the place where we want to know when we're complete, and we need to clear the interval. So this update all segments function here, we're actually getting these time remaining bits, which will now include the complete property. So let's just return that from this function here. So we'll say return time remaining bits dot complete. And now here in our interval, when we set this up, we can say a new variable called isComplete is equal to the result of this update all segments. So we'll get this value of complete back in this variable here, ready to use and clear the interval if necessary. So if we're complete, if the countdown timer is complete, we'll just say clear interval, and then we've got a reference here to the interval itself in this variable called countdown timer. So if we save that, which should set the countdown timer going again, and you can see everything's going fine. But let's just put in a closer date time, just so, what do we need? So if we put in a date in the past, you can see that everything's set as 0. If we set something that's slightly in the future, actually let's just do it for how many seconds are left here. So you can see 27, 26, and when that gets to 0, it should stop. Otherwise, if we didn't do this, what we'd find is that the timer would keep going, this interval would never stop. And when we get to 0, it would just start going to negative numbers and play havoc with our layout. And also, it's not really what you want when you've got a countdown timer. It should stop when it hits 0. So here we go, 2, 1, 0. And there you go, the animation stopped, the interval's been cleared, and we're back to 0 again. So there you go, we're pretty much done. There's just one thing that's not quite right, and that's that each of the segments is flipped. The animation occurs on each interval for each second, and that shouldn't happen really. They should only really flip when there's a change to them. So let's just set the timer going again. So as you see, the hours definitely shouldn't be changing, and the minutes aren't changing, and the second should only change when there's been a value change in that digit. So there are different ways that you could do this, but probably the best place to make this change is to do a check just before we add the animation, and that is actually in the update time segment function. So just here, this is where we sort of add the flipping class. So what we should do is put a check in here that if the value inside of the segment hasn't changed, if the number hasn't changed from the previous value, then just to stop and don't do any of the other actions in this function. And that's pretty straightforward to do. We just set up an if statement here. So we're going to basically, from the segment elements, we can grab any of them because they've all got the same value inside there, but let's go for the segment display top, mainly because it's the first one, and we'll get the text content, the value that's inside of there, and we're going to say, is that value, is that equal to the time value that's been passed into this function? So we're sort of saying here, is the previous value equal to the value that's to the next value, the value that's been passed in? And if that's so, then nothing's changed. So we're just going to return from this function, and it will return early, and none of the rest of the code from here will run. And you can see that does work for most of the values. Most of them have stopped here, apart from the one on the end. But we can run into some problems with null values or values not being set correctly, because we're basically comparing a string with a number here. So probably what we're better off doing is parsing this to an integer in the text content, making sure it's base 10. And then just using a triple equal sign here, just to make sure those two values are completely equal. But if we do that, then you can see that everything's stopped animating apart from the things that are changing. And as we go down through the seconds, we're just about to see the minutes change here now. So you can see 3, 2, 1. Now you can see the minutes has gone down to 55, and the seconds will keep going. And that's pretty much it. That's our countdown timer completed. So just a few little tweaks just to get everything working as we expected, and we've got the interval set up and to be cleared when we hit the completed state. And because we've actually hard-coded the date at the top, no matter how many times we refresh the page and reload it, the time stays the same because it's actually working off this date. We're not counting up to something, we're counting down to this date, and as you can see, it will always stay the same unless we change it to a different value here. And we can get a different countdown timer just by changing this target date, which is a global variable. So that is our JavaScript flip clock countdown timer completed. As mentioned, there are probably other ways that you can do this, but hopefully you've seen this is the simplest way, just by creating all the markup and the CSS separately, and then creating some reusable small JavaScript functions which interact with the elements to actually cause the animation and the update of the values to happen. If you do want to look into different ways of creating dynamic markup within your actual web pages themselves, then you should probably check out this next tutorial where we're going to be making a tic-tac-toe game, and we would be generating all of the markup within our JavaScript itself. But that's it for this project. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.